In today's episode, we go over some of the most deadly bear attacks covered on the channel so far. From man-eating black bears, murderous grizzlies, and even bloodthirsty polar bears, this video is sure to make you think twice about going into the woods ever again. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are some of the most deadly bear attacks you'll ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction. Julien Gautier was a musical composer. He was inspired by the sounds of nature and often took to recording the great outdoors to include in his unique musical performances. He was born in Canada to French parents. The wilderness and great outdoors were an integral part of his upbringing, but at the age of 19, he and his family moved back to France. In 2017, at the age of 42, he secured his dream position as a composer-in-residence for the Brittany Symphony Orchestra. It was an incredible opportunity to showcase his work. The inspiration he got from the natural world was still a big part of his masterpieces. He spent 5 months on the Kerguelen Islands in Antarctica, recording the sounds of nature for his orchestral piece called Symphonie Australe, or Southern Symphony. The piece is intertwined with the sounds of penguins, seals, and the howling, icy winds. A lot of preparation went into making his music. Recording the sounds was the fun part, but organizing the practical and logistical side of his travels was time-consuming. Following the success of his Southern Symphony, which was aired on French radio, he planned a visit back to his roots, Canada. The country was such a large part of his life, and having some of the sounds of home in his future work was a way of keeping Canada close to his heart. The trip was 3 years in the making, and Julien took with him biologist Camille Tuscany. The two of them planned to canoe nearly 1,000 miles down the Mackenzie River from Fort Providence to Inuvik. Along the way, Julien would be recording the sounds of the Canadian wilderness to work into his next symphony. But he would never get the chance to make his musical masterpiece. Disaster was about to strike in the worst way imaginable. The adventure was planned to take 30 days between August and September, and during that time, Camille's main job was to take photos of Julien as he made his recordings. Upon returning to France, Julien then planned to create a mini-concert around the project, with Camille's photos playing in the background. They crammed all their belongings into their two-man canoe. Julien stashed all his sound recording equipment into watertight containers when not in use. At the end of each day, they pulled up, dragging their canoe ashore and set up camp. After eating their dinner around the campfire, they would settle into their tents, ready to take on the next leg of their journey. On August 6th, Julien updated his social media, describing the adventure through the rugged countryside as intense, tiring, and inspiring. During the same update, Julien suggested bear activity in the area. He reported that despite canoeing for 5 days, he and Camille hadn't seen a single soul for 3 of those days, except for 4 bears. Maybe this was a sign of things to come. As they canoed along through the breathtaking scenery, they were heading into some of the most remote wilderness in Canada. But halfway through their trip, something went horribly wrong. On the night of August 14th, 2019, Julien and Camille went to sleep in their separate tents. They had finished their paddling for the day, eaten dinner, and then turned in for the night. But in the darkness, something was approaching. It was drawn to the smells and the presence of 2 humans in its territory. The keen sense of smell, 100 times more powerful than a human's. Bears are thought to be able to home in on their potential prey from 20 miles away. Neither Julien nor Camille stirred. Outside their tents was a grizzly bear. It sniffed around their campsite, searching for signs of food. The sound from the river's rushing water masked any footsteps or snorts from the investigating bear. It was stealthy, curious, and it was on the hunt. A predatory bear can stalk a human undetected. Despite their immense size, they have the ability to sneak up on unsuspecting prey until they are within pouncing distance. The bear let out a low growl as it sniffed the canvas of Julien's tent. The photographer continued to sleep, unaware of the imminent danger he was in. Suddenly, it tore through the thin tent sides, its sharp, curved claws slicing through the canvas like tissue paper. A second later, and without hesitation, the bear dived inside. Before Julien could tell what was happening, he felt an immense weight on top of him, pushing him down. The claws from the bear tore into his chest, and he gasped. Then it thrust its face forwards and clamped its jaws around Julien's neck. The attack was rapid, powerful, and relentless. With no light to see what was going on, Julien grappled in the darkness. His cries were silenced by the river and by the crushing of the bear's jaws, suffocating him and making it impossible for him to cry out. Then the bear tugged, forcefully pulling Julien from his tent. He kicked with his legs, trying to get away from the animal. He punched and tried to grab the bear, pulling at it, trying to find a weak spot, but nothing he did deterred the bear. Although he tried to fight back, the bear had taken him completely by surprise, and he hadn't been able to defend himself. He had been in a deep sleep when he was pounced on, and with a bite force of around 1,000 psi, he struggled to release the bear's grip around his neck. The bear held onto Julien and dragged him away from his tent. The weight of Julien's body flattened the surrounding vegetation, leaving a trail of evidence. Blood poured from his neck as the bear's teeth severed blood vessels. He was losing blood fast and fading rapidly. With his adventure partner none the wiser and no one there to help him, he was at the mercy of the grizzly. But there isn't much one can do when a bear is in predatory mode. Most experts advise fighting back if the bear is intent on eating you, although it will likely stop at nothing. With male grizzly bears weighing in excess of 300 kilograms, 660 pounds, they are incredibly strong and powerful. A single swipe with their paw is enough to break a man's neck. The bear pulled Julien into the tree line, and moments later, Julien took his final breaths. He had lost too much blood. The injuries he sustained during the attack were unsurvivable, and he now lay motionless in the dark. The next morning, when dawn appeared on the horizon, Camille awoke from her slumber. She unzipped her tent and looked out through the flimsy canvas door. There, she saw the state of Julien's tent. It had been completely destroyed and now lay in a flattened and torn mess on the ground. Camille leapt up and jumped outside. She immediately began calling out for Julien. Her heart was in her mouth. She knew something terrible had happened to him and searched high and low for him. She could see the pools of blood around his tent. She followed the blood trail before spotting some other travelers. She ran over to them, distressed and begging for help. They had an emergency locating beacon and immediately activated it. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police received the distress beacon alert at 7:45 on the morning of August 15th. The signal was coming from 50 kilometers south of Tulita. The area was only accessible by sea and by air. The police and experts from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources flew into the area by helicopter. A search was immediately launched. There was clear evidence at the campsite of a bear attack, and now there was very little hope of finding Julien alive. Poor weather conditions hampered the search, and it wasn't until the following day that Julien's body was discovered. Camille and the group of other travelers she had made contact with for help were airlifted out of the area, physically unharmed. Members of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources located 2 bears in the area, a brown bear and a black bear. They shot both of them, and they were taken off to the labs for necropsies. Details from the findings have not been released, but it has been accepted that it was a grizzly bear that had attacked Julien. It was an incredibly tragic incident, made all the more tragic due to its rarity. Megan Wolberg from Environment and Natural Resources said that human-bear encounters in the Northwest Territories are not uncommon, but fatalities are rare. There are estimated to be around 4,000 to 5,000 grizzlies in the Northwest Territories and a similar number of black bears. There had been 3 fatal attacks in the region since 2001. 2 of those were by black bears and 1 from a grizzly. Unfortunately, on August 6, 2017, Julien Gautier was added to those statistics of the latest bear attack victim to meet their terrifying final affliction. September in Alaska is one of the most picturesque times of the year to visit the state. It's the month where summer just starts to lose its hold. The landscape turns crisp and clear, and it's sprinkled with the orange and yellow hues of autumn. This is also the final flurry of activity in the vast wilderness. Animals hurry to finish their winter dens and to eat what last living morsels are left growing to build up as much fat as they can for the long winter months ahead. Once the winter truly settles in, both animals and humans are confined by the snow and ice that blanket the landscape. Robert Harris Weaver, or Chupa as his friends liked to call him, and his wife Nina were taking advantage of the last of the good weather that September. Robert was an Alaskan native. The only time he'd left his home state for an extended period of time was to attend university. But once he got his degree and met Nina, he and his new wife came back to Robert's home. There, they'd raised their children, and Robert took over his old man's business. Now that the children were grown and out of the house, raising kids of their own, Robert was slowly phasing out of the family business, handing it over to his son, just like his father had done before him. Robert and Nina had the leisure of going hunting, fishing, or just staying at their cabin beside Lake George whenever they felt like it. However, this trip was a special one. Robert wanted to catch the last phase of the hunting season, hoping to bring down a moose for himself and maybe a few more to hand out to his grown-up children. They also planned to check on the cabin to get some last-minute repairs done and drop off a few supplies before the first snowfall of the season. After the season came to an end and the snowfall became too deep to navigate through, he and Nina were going to spend their first ever winter in their cabin alone. In the years before, their trips were always with their children or friends, and then only in the spring and summer. But since they were technically retired now, they wanted to have an unconventional second honeymoon by trapping themselves inside the comfy cabin for the whole winter, with only each other for company. In 2013, they didn't have the internet and satellites that we have today, so they were going to be severely limited in the amount of contact they could have with the outside world. But both of them were fit and healthy, so they weren't too worried about running into trouble. In the event that something were to happen to one of them, at least they had a satellite phone to call for help if they had to. And the ancient cell phones of the day did get signal from inside the cabin. The rest of their food, books, generators, and board games were already at the cabin, just waiting for the winter, so that they could be cracked open and enjoyed. If their hunt went well tomorrow, the two would return to town for the next few weeks, before coming back with the last of their supplies, just in time to lock themselves in for winter. On their second-to-last morning on the lake, the two headed out to go fishing before everything froze over solid. They came back to shore in the early afternoon. The cabin was just a short walk from the dock, but even so, it was already cold enough to want to get indoors before the late afternoon, when the temperature dropped and predators like wolves and lynxes had a habit of prowling around the lakeside. Robert had left his hunting rifle up at the cabin, and he didn't like the idea of being caught out in the open without a weapon to defend himself and his wife. Their thoughts of predators weren't unfounded at all. The area was known to have just about every animal in North America, and the extra activity that the autumn brought for the wildlife also came with the pre-winter jitters that animals had when they were hurrying to settle down, and they could be quite unpredictable at this time of year. They tied their boat to the dock and started to make their way back home. Robert was carrying the fishing poles and the tackle box, and Nina had her 2 buckets of fish. They chatted as they walked and kept their eyes on the uneven ground before them. It was easy to take a tumble over a rock or twist your ankle in an indentation in the ground. They walked about 100 yards up the slightly sloping hill before they started moving through bushes and the first growth of the forest. Another 50 yards ahead, in the thick of the trees, stood their 2-bedroom log house, almost completely hidden from view. A few hours before they arrived, an old male black bear had begun to poke around the place. It came from the forest that morning when it caught a whiff of something edible. The old bear found 2 trash cans and spent the morning ripping open the bags, rummaging through the contents, and eating whatever it could find. By the time Nina and Robert came back, the bear had left a mess of strewn garbage at the back of the cabin, and it was quite annoyed. The food sure smelled promising all the way out in the forest, but there was so little in the plastic bins that its stomach wasn't even close to capacity. It had wasted all of the morning on just a few scraps, and now it had to start looking for food all over again this late in the day. Just as it was about to leave, it caught the scent of something else: fish. The bear smelled Nina's catch long before it even heard the couple's approach. It was just picking up speed, jogging toward the smell, when it stopped short at the sight of the people walking toward it. Nina and Robert both had their heads down and didn't notice the animal standing in the crop of trees. For a moment, the bear took in the situation. It was hungry, and Nina definitely carried the source of the promising smell. But black bears preferred to avoid humans if they could. The old bear wasn't stupid. It knew very well that people might seem small and weak, but they were an unpredictable species, and this kind of bear was naturally wired to avoid them when they could. Standing very still, the male mulled over what to do, but before he could make up his mind, the people were coming dangerously close to where he was standing. It was becoming increasingly nervous about their proximity, and the added smell of fish was grating on his senses, adding fuel to the winter jitters. The people were now just a few meters away from the unstable bear, which reared on its hind legs, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Nina and Robert nearly jumped out of their skin at the sudden blast of sound from the trees. The bear stormed forward a few feet, trying to show off as much of its 230 pounds as it could in the hopes of intimidating them. It still wasn't quite sure how to approach the situation, so it waited for them to make the first move. Apparently, they reacted the wrong way. Nina was slightly ahead of her husband when she dropped her 2 buckets, spilling the contents over the rocks beneath her feet, and she screamed. Robert rushed forward, placing himself between the animal and his wife, yelling and waving his arms as he went. This wasn't the first time Robert had come across a black bear, and all of them, even the ones as big as this one, ran away if you made enough noise, but he'd never walked into one head-on. The creature saw this as a direct attack, and its instincts took over. Its velvet coat shook majestically as it sped over the ground at the man who was posing the greatest threat. It streaked at an alarming speed, covering the 12 or so meters between them in just a few strides. Robert managed to shout at Nina to run just before the bear's massive body slammed into him, forcing the air out of his lungs and sending him crashing into the ground. The bear and man skidded across the rocky lakeshore, the jagged rocks tearing away the back of Robert's jacket as they went. Nina ran, and she didn't look back to see the animal on top of her husband, tearing with its paws and teeth at Robert's chest and head. But she did hear his agonized screams and the murderous growls and roars from the bear behind her. Nina reached the cabin in seconds, yanked open the door, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. Nina was confident enough with the rifle. She'd had many turns during target practice, but she'd never actually had to use the weapon to bring anything down. Running and fumbling with it, she loaded the rifle as she made her way back to where Robert was. But when the scene came into view, her stomach dropped. The man laying on the ground was no longer recognizable as Robert. His entire upper body had been mauled so badly that there was little left to see of him except copious amounts of blood and the shreds that were once his face. The animal was still on top of Robert, and somehow Robert was still alive, his arms feebly grabbing onto whatever piece of fur he could. In the seconds that Nina had taken to get the gun and come back, Robert's screams had turned into bloody gurgles and painful gasps. She raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. The gun was jammed tight, so she struck the nose of it against a nearby rock and fired again and again and again. Still nothing, just that empty click. Nina, desperate and panicked, threw the entire gun at the creature When the heavy metal shaft hit the bear, it lifted Robert, who had now stopped moving, into the air by its jaws and threw him aside. Robert landed with the dead weight of a stone several feet away. Nina grabbed one of her plastic buckets and threw that at the bear too. Enraged beyond reason, the animal then rushed at Nina. With only seconds to react, she managed to get hold of a sizable rock and threw it at the approaching creature, hitting it square on the forehead. That last stone saved Nina's life. The beast was momentarily dazed as she realized just how close it was to her. She could smell the earth and blood on its body and see the chunks of her husband's skin stuck in its muzzle. Nina did the only wise thing she could. She ran. She didn't look back. She knew she only had a few seconds before the animal came to its senses. The rock was just enough to buy her those precious few seconds, and she pumped her legs harder than she had ever done in her life. She skidded through the open door of their cabin, shutting it behind her. The bear had turned back to Robert when it shook off the blow. Seeing that the woman was nearly at the house, it didn't bother to go after her, not when the other one was already taken care of. Inside the log building, Nina scrambled to find her cell phone. The satellite phone that they carried for emergencies was strapped to Robert's belt, and there was no way to get it now. She found it and dialed 911. Before the operator answered, Nina was at the window, but the bear and Robert were both gone. Even from a distance, she could see the bloody drag marks that led into the forest. Sobbing and nearly incoherent, she tried to explain what had happened to the woman who finally picked up at the other end of the line. It took a good 10 minutes before the operator had some idea of the situation and a rough set of directions to get to the secluded place in the Alaskan wilderness. This garbled set of instructions, given by the hysterical Nina, made it difficult for emergency helicopters to locate the cabin. But from the air, the pilot spotted their blue Jeep standing out against the green and yellow of the autumn trees. By that time, it was already evening, and poor Nina was still huddled with her back to the door. She was taken away by air to be treated for shock at the closest hospital, even before the search for Robert began. All through the night and well into the next morning, rescue personnel and almost every person in a 50-mile radius of the lake came out to help. By the light of day, they could follow the bloody trail and finally locate Robert's remains hidden in a dugout den. The animal had obviously feasted on the man through the night, but there was no sign of the bear yet, so the search was widened. If bears attack once, the likelihood of them doing it again is almost certain. They couldn't take any chances. But in the end, the bear found them first. It came back to continue its feeding on Robert's remains, only to find a trooper standing at his hidey hole, and its kill was gone, taken away to the morgue the night before. The animal knew, after killing Robert, that this was an opportunity for another easy meal to add to its winter stash. But unfortunately for the black bear, this trooper did not have a rifle that jammed at the wrong moment. He became aware of the movement behind him and discovered the animal obviously stalking him, ready to pounce on the man from behind. When the other searchers and troopers heard the 4 shots ring out across the forest, they converged to the source of the blasts. They found the trooper alive and well, with a fully grown black bear lying dead at his feet. It was later confirmed with a necropsy that the animal indeed had Robert's remains in its digestive tract, so at the very least the danger was removed from the area. But the lake stood devoid of people for almost 2 years anyway. Nina gave the cabin and surrounding property over to her children, but they didn't want to set foot in the place where their father had died either. So, in the end, it was sold off to another family, who still makes use of it to this very day. But thankfully, no bear attacks have occurred there since Robert's terrifying final affliction. Barbara Pasche loved bears. In fact, she loved them so much that she broke the law so that she could see them up close. By leaving out sunflower seeds and millet in her backyard, she enticed them to her back door. She admired the impressive animals, watching safely from behind her windows. Not only was she feeding the bears for her own satisfaction, but she also felt like she was ensuring they had food in times of hardship. However, It is illegal to feed bears, and for very good reason. Bears can become habituated to humans. They learn to associate people with food and a free meal. And if that food is ever withdrawn, then they can become aggressive, destructive, and deadly. By feeding her beloved wild bears, Barbara was not only putting her neighbors in danger, but she was also putting herself in danger. On top of that, she inadvertently put the bears in harm's way. If they ever turned aggressive or were seen getting too close to people's properties, then they would be removed or worse, killed by the authorities. But Barbara didn't think of those consequences, and even when she was cited for her behavior in 2012, she continued to feed black bears in her neighborhood. But now something was about to go horribly wrong. Barbara was an 85-year-old woman who lived beside Ashley Lake near Kalispell, in the northwestern corner of Montana. It was a beautiful location. Her rural home was on the outskirts of Flathead National Forest, which lies adjacent to Glacier National Park, an area known for its bears. There may have been a reason for Barbara's careless behavior, something that changed her perspective on things. In 2009, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and her family believed that this altered her perspective on how to preserve wildlife wisely and safely. On September 27, 2015, a time when bears were filling up their fat reserves ready for the long winter months ahead, a bear walked into Barbara's yard. It was expecting the usual food that she scattered about her lawn, but this time, Barbara hadn't put any out that day, so instead the bear went searching for some. It was a young, female black bear. She had learned to associate Barbara's house with an easy meal. The bear walked across the yard and towards the house. It sniffed around the sides of the building, working its way towards the back door. Inside, Barbara was unaware that one of her favorite animals was so close. But this wasn't just a curious bear. It was a hungry bear. And it was a conditioned bear. Somehow the bear managed to force itself inside Barbara's house and began turning the place upside down. When Barbara heard a noise in her kitchen, she went to investigate. Then, as she peered around the corner of the hallway, she spotted the bear rummaging through her things. It was one of the black bears she was familiar with, but inside her home it looked much bigger. Barbara froze and watched in horror for a few moments as the bear ransacked her house. She couldn't reach her phone without moving, and she would have to get past the bear to get out of her house. She was trapped. Nobody knows how the bear got inside the property, but it spotted Barbara shortly afterwards and lumbered towards her. With nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, the elderly lady braced herself for what was to come. The bear suddenly leapt up at Barbara, its jaws clacking, its powerful paws pushing her to the floor. Barbara let out a yell, but nothing could have prepared her for the attack that ensued. She crashed onto the floor, the air escaping from her lungs, and she gasped. She smacked the back of her head on the ground and looked up at the mighty beast. Its dripping jowls were just inches from her face. She could smell its breath. She could see directly into its dark, shiny eyes. The bear growled as it pushed its face into Barbara. She tried to protect herself, desperately trying to curl up into the fetal position and interlock her hands behind her neck. But she was still exposed. The bear tore into the old lady's flesh, its canines ripping into her shoulders and arms. It pinned her down with its large paws as its claws sliced her skin. Barbara screamed for help, and moments later the bear stepped off her, climbed up onto a work surface, and climbed out through one of the windows. The attack had only lasted a few seconds, but the damage had been done. As the adrenaline wore off, Barbara could now feel the intense, searing pain from the attack. She lay bleeding on the floor of her home, unable to move and unable to reach the phone. She was in a state of shock and in desperate need of help, but no one came. As the minutes ticked by, Barbara was losing consciousness. The wounds had cut deep into her muscle, torn tendons, and were festering with bacteria. She was fading fast, but Barbara was a fighter, and she managed to pull herself towards her home phone and call for help. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The sheriff's department, along with the wildlife response team, rushed to the rural scene. When officers broke into the property, they found the home completely ransacked and Barbara lying on the floor. They rushed to her side. Miraculously, she was still breathing. She was still alive, but only just. Barbara was ambulanced off to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in a critical condition. Nobody knew if she would make it. Over the next couple of days, doctors fought to save Barbara, and she was a tough lady. It looked like she was going to pull through, giving everyone the hope they needed. But then, tragically, on the morning of October 1st, she passed away from her injuries. Her death was a shock for the neighborhood. She was popular amongst the locals, and her loss was felt far and wide. Following the devastating attack, the whole community was put on high alert. There was a killer on the loose, and it wasn't afraid to break into people's homes to get what it wanted. Traps were set up to catch the bear responsible. Officers walked from door to warn people about the bear or bears in the area, but their efforts to capture the nuisance bear were thwarted when they discovered that somebody else in the neighborhood was also feeding the bears. And not only that, they continued to feed the bears even after hearing the news about Barbara and knowing an investigation was in full swing. With wildlife officers posted to the neighborhood night and day, they managed to catch 2 black bears. They weren't very old, only yearlings, but in their young lives they had become dependent on humans for food. The 2 bears confidently strolled into the neighborhood searching for food. The seed that various people had put out in their gardens had kept them coming back for more, but given the recent events, they were now seen as a threat to the community. With heavy hearts, the wildlife officers euthanized both of them. When the yearlings were taken away and examined, they had a significant amount of millet and sunflower seeds in their digestive tracts. The people who had deliberately fed the bears had now contributed to their deaths. The officers had no choice. The bears had learned that they could get an easy meal from the neighborhood and weren't going to stop coming back. It would be irresponsible to release potentially dangerous bears somewhere else when the bears are habituated to people. Scientific evidence suggests that bears pass on their nuisance behavior to their cubs too. So when these 2 black bears matured, they could bring their cubs back to the same neighborhood with potentially disastrous consequences. But the DNA from both the yearlings were not exact matches to the bear that was responsible for Barbara's death. Results did, however, show that the bear that attacked Barbara was a sister of one of the euthanized bears. After 3 weeks of setting up traps and scouting the area, the search for the bear was called off. There are thought to be around 15,000 black bears throughout Montana and 800 grizzlies. Brown bears are responsible for the most attacks across North America, but they are considered rare, and fatalities from them are rarer still. A black bear entering a home and fatally mauling someone has never been heard of before, and no known fatalities have ever occurred from bear attacks in Flathead's 2.5 million acre forest until now, after Barbara Pasche met her terrifying final affliction. In May 2005 in Canmore, Canada, Fish and Wildlife officials relocated a 4-year-old male grizzly bear. The bear wasn't aggressive, nor had it caused any damage, but it was hanging around the golf course, located just outside of town. Normally, it would have been left to its own devices, but after a woman walking along one of the hiking trails stumbled upon it, it stormed at her. The beast did not physically assault the woman. The display was mostly for show, but it was a close enough call, and given the many reports of the animal in the vicinity in the weeks prior, authorities deemed it safer to tranquilize it and move it 10 miles deeper into the wilderness. Normally, relocations take place over 50 miles or more from the area that bears are removed to. But in this case, since the animal hadn't technically been violent, the extra mileage wasn't deemed necessary. But that bear was dead set on making the golf course its new home. Less than a week later, it was spotted right back on the premises, and before authorities could decide what to do about the situation, nature took its course, and they would forever regret their decision not to carry the animal just a few more miles away. Isabelle Dube, mother to 5-year-old Lucy, was the unfortunate victim of the authorities' call to play it safe. She and 2 of her friends were jogging on one of the many trails around the golf course. The area was a popular destination for hikers, bikers, and joggers, and Isabelle had been making use of the trails for years. She, and both of the women who were running with her that day, were accomplished marathon runners, and they were in the middle of training for 3 separate marathons that they were planning on running before the summer came to an end. Lucy was home with her father, and Isabelle was planning on making a day-long training session of the rare opportunity to get away from home. The morning started out well enough, with all of the women keeping a good pace. Their first 40 minutes on the trail was covered in relative silence, keeping their speed and focusing on their breathing. There was no time for chit-chat or pit stops. The animal didn't even realize that 3 people were approaching. Just as it was crossing the trail, the 3 women came around the bend, only 4 feet away from where the massive brown beast was strolling over. Isabelle and her friends quite literally ran into the worst place at the worst time, completely by chance. When their running shoes skidded to a halt, sending pebbles flying in all directions, the bear gave an almost comical jerk of surprise. It's hard to say who was more shocked at the run-in, the women or the grizzly, but it was Isabelle and the bear who reacted instinctively. Isabelle's companions froze in terror, and that shell-shocked reaction is probably what saved their lives. Isabelle, however, bolted. Her flight response switched on the moment she laid eyes on the beast that was so close that she could smell the damp fur on its body. Without thinking, she turned to the left and ran straight at the nearest tree, everything in her mind telling her to get to higher ground. Normally, this wouldn't have been the worst idea in this kind of situation. Grizzlies aren't very proficient climbers. That's not to say that they won't climb trees if they have to, they just aren't prone to it. But this quick movement was enough to shake the bear out of its momentary startled state. Just like Isabelle, instinct took over. When she ran, it ran after her. Neither one of them were thinking. Isabelle just wanted to flee, and the animal just needed to eradicate the creature that intruded on its space. Isabelle clawed at the tall pine next to the path, but she'd barely made it off the ground when the bear reached her. It lashed out its paw. Its nails didn't snag her, but the blow was so hard that it broke Isabelle's ankle as soon as it connected with her foot. Isabelle went flying into the forest floor. She hit the ground on her stomach, sliding on the damp earth before she came to a stop. The 2 women still on the trail snapped out of their shocked trance and ran as fast as they could back the way they'd come. Both of them knew full well that trying to fight off a fully grown grizzly was a death sentence for all 3 of them. The best chance they had of getting themselves out alive was if they ran for help while the bear was distracted. But now Isabelle was alone and completely at the mercy of the enraged animal. She tried to get up, but her broken ankle promptly folded beneath her, forcing her to her hands and knees. And then the animal was on top of her again. This time its full body weight landed on her back, driving her face first into the layer of dead leaves and earth. With her mouth full of leaves and dirt, Isabelle's screams were muffled as the animal went wild on top of her, with no way to run or climb her way out, and the full enormous weight pinning her down. Isabelle had to endure the agony of her back being torn to shreds by the claws that were slashing at her, without the ability to protect herself or even to attempt to flee. The bear closed its jaws around the back of her head, and with its body still pinning her down, it yanked her head back so far that it broke her neck, finally putting an end to what must have been an unimaginably excruciating ordeal. The women who had run for help were only half a kilometer away from the golf course's clubhouse, where they alerted one of the officers who was stationed there. By the time they made it back to the place where the attack had happened, the bear was standing over the dead body of Isabelle Dube, still tearing and ripping at her limp remains. It was so crazed and focused on its victim that it didn't even hear the approaching officer. It only took one bullet to bring the bear down, where it collapsed right on top of Isabelle. It would later take 4 men to move the carcass so that they could get Isabelle out from under it, but it was too late. Isabelle was embedded in the forest floor. Her broken and torn body would never run another race again. She sadly met her terrifying final affliction. Erin Johnson was 27 years old. She had graduated from Chugiak High School in 2007 and had gone on to study geology and botany at the University of Montana and Anchorage, Alaska. She was adventurous and loved the outdoors. She had a passion for Nordic skiing and excelled in the sport, going on to represent the USA in the Junior Olympic Nordic ski team in 2006 and 2007. Her passion for the outdoors and adventure was reflected in the career she embarked on. She worked for Alaska Biological Research, putting her studies to good use as a field technician. On June 19, 2017, she was assigned to work at Pogo Mine. The mine, situated 90 miles east of Fairbanks in Alaska, is a gold mine that has been operating since 2006. It was owned by Japanese mining companies Sumitomo Metal Mining and Sumitomo Corporation, but has since changed hands to Australian gold producer Northern Star Resources. Erin's job was to collect geological samples from the land around the mine. The mine employs contractors to conduct work at its sites, but being very much in bear country, it ensures anyone working for it undergoes practical bear training. Employees are taught how to safely and effectively use bear spray and have the option of carrying a rifle into the field with them too. No one is sent out to work alone, as it is considered too dangerous. 6 people were employed to conduct field work on that fateful day in June. They were paired off to ensure each other's safety, and Erin was paired with 38-year-old Ellen Trainer from Fairbanks. The employees were transported by helicopter to their respective sites and began work. The whole group was in radio contact with one another as they were dropped off into the wilderness in their pairs. Unfortunately for Erin and Ellen, the helicopter had just dropped them a short distance from a very hungry male black bear. Erin and Ellen got to work. They collected soil samples along a transect that could then be analyzed for different components back in the labs. They needed to record the exact location of each sample, as well take detailed notes regarding the surrounding vegetation, soil structure, and pH. It was an incredible place to work. Being in the outdoors, conducting scientific research, was better than any desk job, and the 2 like-minded women hit it off straight away. But being so focused on taking the soil samples, they didn't notice a predator approaching them from downwind. The male black bear had smelt them from a long way off and had crept closer to investigate. When it spotted the 2 women, it changed into predatory mode. It moved silently through the trees, standing stock still whenever the women stood up or turned to look in his direction. It was hidden by the wide tree trunks. Any sound of his approach was muted by the breeze rattling the branches and the quiet chatter of the 2 women as they worked. The bear was cunning. He approached the pair from behind, out of their line of sight. At the time, Erin and Ellen were talking about the presence of bears in the area. They had completed the most recent round of bear training only 2 months earlier. They discussed the action they should take if they did come across a bear. Little did they know that their training was about to be put to the test as the bear moved closer. It managed to get within 3 meters of the 2 workers before they saw it. Erin and Ellen looked up at the imposing figure of the black bear. He was staring at them, and their eyes locked. They were in a vulnerable position, both crouched on the ground collecting samples. Their hearts thundered in their chests for a few moments, and they instinctively reached for their bear spray, which was attached to a holster on their hips. But the bear rushed at them. It covered the distance between them in less than a second and swiped with its huge, powerful paws. Erin was sent crashing to the ground, and the bear immediately leapt on top of her. In a desperate attempt to save her colleague, Ellen sprayed the bear in its face as it tucked into Erin. The bear shook its head and stepped backwards momentarily before lunging at them again. It tore into Erin, But as Ellen continued to release her bear spray and yell and shout, the bear turned its attention to her. It let go of Erin, who had been badly mauled, and jumped on top of Ellen. The attack was ferocious and unforgiving. The bear wasn't afraid of the two women. It was intent on causing as much damage as quickly as possible. The two women were fighting back, but it seemed like nothing they did deterred the bear. It continued its powerful attack, biting and clawing at the two women, though Erin got the brunt of it. Teeth bit into her head, neck, and shoulders. The long, sharp claws sliced across her chest and torso. The sound of the bear growling as it mauled the two women over and over filled their ears, a terrifying sound of a great predator devouring its meal. In all the commotion, Ellen lost her glasses. She was now fighting blind. She lost sight of Erin, and she lost sight of the bear. With all the shouting and hitting back, the bear retreated. It skulked away, looking back over its shoulder at its injured prey. Hurriedly, Ellen grabbed the radio and transmitted a mayday call. They were just 8 kilometers from the mine, and within minutes they heard the whirring of a helicopter high over the trees. Ellen didn't move. She was lying unresponsive on the ground. As the helicopter lowered a winch down, Ellen was lifted into the sky and back to the mine, where she was transported by ambulance to hospital in Fairbanks. The helicopter then returned for Erin, but she was nowhere to be seen. An employee from Pogo Mine was lowered to the ground to search for her. He could see the disturbed earth where the two women had put up a fight. He could see spatters of blood and the scattered equipment across the ground. And then he noticed a trail. The vegetation had been flattened where something or someone had been dragged. Cautiously, he followed it, with his rifle locked and loaded. Just yards along the trail, he spotted the bear, standing over Erin's body. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired at the bear. It slumped to the ground, and he raced to Erin's side. She was gone. Tragically, she had lost her life in the great outdoors. Although she had been doing something she loved, she was taken far too young. The news of her passing was a shock for those working for the mine and a terrible and irreplaceable loss for her family. Only a few weeks earlier, Erin had married the love of her life and best friend, Abe. They were embarking on their new lives together when the tragedy struck, and now Abe would have to navigate his life without Erin by his side. Her family described her as a beautiful, compassionate, and passionate person who lived her life to the fullest. The Department of Fish and Game investigated the incident. From what Ellen described and from the evidence found at the scene, the two women had been victims of a predatory attack. These attacks are incredibly rare and are the most dangerous. Very little can be done if you are unknowingly being stalked by a bear, as they use the element of surprise to creep up on you before delivering a highly aggressive and powerful attack. Often the attack is too sudden to deploy the use of bear spray or a gun. After recovering in hospital from her injuries, Ellen was able to provide more details of the attack. She described how she sprayed the bear extensively in the face, but to no avail. The bear wasn't deterred by the spray and ensued its hyper-aggressive attack on the two women. It was intent on killing them, and nothing, it seemed, would stop it from succeeding. As news of the attack spread, those living in Alaska were deeply concerned. It was the second fatal mauling by a bear in the state in the same week. Only days earlier, a 16-year-old boy had been killed in a predatory attack whilst he ran in a cross-country race south of Anchorage. A further 2 attacks occurred 1 week later, but the victims managed to escape with their lives. Alaska had only ever recorded 6 fatal bear attacks in the previous 130 years. Then, all of a sudden, 4 attacks, 2 of which were fatal, came along at once, all within a couple of weeks of each other. Fear swept through the communities. Could the bears be learning that people were easy prey? Where they had once been fearful of people, turning the other way when they crossed paths, were they now realizing that people were slower and easier to take down than their typical food? The Alaska Department of Fish and Game urged people to carry bear spray or a gun when out in the wilderness. They tried to ease people's fears after the recent and deadly attacks by describing them as incredibly rare. Brown bears are more notoriously aggressive than black bears, but typically that is only when they are protecting their young. They advised Alaskans to stand their ground if they come across a bear and talk firmly to it, rather than run away or play dead. If the bear attacks, they said, it is best to throw rocks or hit it around the face. Sadly, none of this advice worked for Erin, who sadly met her terrifying final affliction. Polar bears are known to be one of the most fearsome predators in the natural world. You've all heard the advice when coming across a bear. If it's brown, lay down. If it's black, fight back. If it's white, good night. Luckily, polar bear attacks are very rare, and there have only been a few recorded fatalities. Despite this, the number of bear attacks worldwide have gradually been increasing over the last couple decades. Increased food scarcity and habitat destruction is forcing these animals to leave their natural environment and encroach onto human territory in search of food. What little habitat these animals have left is often used for hunting and hiking by humans, leaving them with very few places to go, as the likelihood of encountering someone increases. While brown bears have always been the main perpetrators of these bear attacks in North America, there is an alarming trend growing as polar bear attacks are on the rise. Erin Gibbons was 31 years old in 2018 and was considered to be an incredibly experienced and talented hunter. He was a family man, someone who held his 3 children above all else and kept them safe no matter what. He lived in Arviat, Nunavut, an area known to be very remote, suffering incredibly cold temperatures throughout the winter. This meant the community must help each other out if they were to survive the season. Erin regularly used his hunting skills for the good of his community, selflessly providing meat for those in need. Aside from the cold, the area shared its land with an apex predator, the polar bear. Despite the close proximity, there had not been an attack in the area for 18 years, and the indigenous people knew to leave the animals alone, creating an understanding between the bears and the people of mutual respect and solitude. Naturally, there had still been encounters with the bears, so a patrol had been set up on the outskirts of town to protect the inhabitants. Their job was to redirect any bears who got too close to the settlement. Aside from a few interactions, there was relative harmony between the people and the bears. On July 3rd, Erin decided to visit Sentry Island with his children to take them fishing and spend some quality time together. The island was around 10 miles away from their home by boat and was a regular fishing spot for locals and tourists alike, particularly as it was a hot spot for beluga whales. The family planned on gathering some bird eggs on the island, and as soon as they landed on shore, the children ran off the boat, excited to spend time with their dad for the day. He briefed them on the do's and don'ts of their activities to make sure they would be as safe as possible, but he didn't foresee any issues for the day. After explaining some of the dangers, the children headed off to collect their eggs. Erin was proud to see how excited they were and was ready to slowly teach them everything he knew so that they could grow up protected by his knowledge. While watching the children, he spotted something in the distance, and the longer he stared at it, the colder his blood turned. A polar bear was slowly stalking his youngest daughter, creeping closer and closer to where she was searching. The bear's ears were facing backwards, signaling to Erin that the bear considered his daughter to be prey, and he knew that there was no way that she would win the fight against the bear. At this time, she was completely unaware, assessing a nearby bird's nest to see which eggs she should take back to her dad. Erin shouted to his children, telling them to run to the boat as fast as they could. He sprinted towards them, trying to get between the bear and the children, but as he ran, he realized he had left his rifle on the boat. He was running towards a polar bear on the hunt with no protection but his bare hands. With no time to go back for his rifle, he began hurling rocks at the animal in an attempt to distract or scare it away from his children. Erin was desperate and knew he would do anything he could to save his children. Thankfully, a few of his rocks hit the animal and confused it, stopping the predator in its tracks momentarily. He was so thankful that his children were no longer in the animal's pursuit that it took him a second to realize that all of the bear's attention was now fixed on him instead, and he was completely unarmed. He shouted to his eldest daughter on the boat, telling her to call for help on the radio while he continued to throw rocks at the bear, hoping to scare it off. Erin quickly realized that the rocks weren't scaring the bear away as it continued to approach him. Terrified and running out of options, he decided to break all the rules. He turned his back on the animal and ran for the boat. He could hear the bear behind him and knew that it was much faster than him. He just needed to get close enough to the boat so his daughter could throw him the rifle. It was his only chance. He ran along the shore, praying that he would be able to make it back to his children in time. Unfortunately, polar bears run more than 30 miles per hour. It was impossible for him to outrun the bear. He looked at his children one last time as he was pulled to the ground while the bear leapt onto him from behind. The animal grabbed him by the neck and began throwing him from side to side, the strength of the bear making Erin seem like a rag doll in its grip. The pain must have been excruciating as his body was thrown into the rocks and ice beneath him, while his children were forced to watch. When Erin finally stopped moving, the bear climbed on top of him and began to eat him, ending the life of Erin Gibbons. The children were traumatized and begged for someone to come and help them over the radio. They hid in the boat, listening to the sounds of their father being devoured by the predator. Their prayers were soon answered as an emergency team arrived and took the children away before shooting and killing the polar bear. Erin's body was half-eaten at this point and was taken back to his family in Arviat. Everyone was devastated by the loss. He was an important part of the community and well-liked by all. His sacrifice was not in vain, as he saved his 3 children, despite losing his life. 2 years later, his bravery was recognized in a Canadian ceremony by the Governor-General and Commander-in-Chief of Canada, Julie Payette. He received the Star of Courage for the defense of his children, and although he was not alive to receive it, his family were able to keep it as a physical reminder of the courage of Erin, who was truly a hero to his family before meeting his final affliction.